As we delve deeper into the mysterious final moments of Custer's last stand, we're venturing into territory clouded by speculation and uncertainty. Up until the point when Trumpeter Martini left, with Lieutenant Cook's note, we had the benefit of testimony, albeit conflicting, from various participants. After this, however, we are left without reliable first-hand accounts to describe the events that led to the deaths of 210 men, including the infamous George Custer. After crossing the Rosebud Little Bighorn Divide, Custer made a pivotal decision to divide his regiment into 4 separate battalions. This strategic move involved sending Bentigni to scout the ridges to the left and investigate the upper Little Bighorn Valley for any signs of native encampments. Meanwhile, Custer's and Reno's battalions continued their rapid descent along Reno Creek, Custer's men sticking to the right bank, while Reno's rode along the left. This hasty progression was fueled by Custer's fear that they had already been spotted by Indian scouts, which could lead to the scattering of the village they intended to surprise. Their haste, however, may have caused more harm than good. As the regiment advanced, they encountered an area previously used by the Native Americans as a campground. At this point, the valley widened, and soon the regiment approached the open flats. Here Custer brought Reno's command to the right bank to ride parallel for a short period, issuing new orders as they prepared for the attack. It was in this area where the infamous lone teepee was discovered. Interpreter Gerard, upon surveying the area from a nearby knoll, reportedly saw Native Americans hastily driving their ponies downstream. His exclamation, "There go your Indians running like devils," foreshadowed the coming chaos. Shortly after, Agent Cook relayed orders to Reno to attack the village, reassuring him that Custer would provide full support. However, as Reno advanced, Custer's plans changed. A report from Gerard, through Cook, reached him that the Native Americans were no longer fleeing, but turning back to confront Reno's battalion. Custer, realizing that surprise was no longer on his side, made a swift decision, believing the Native Americans were setting up a defensive line to protect the village and allow their families to escape. Custer swung right in an attempt to flank them. His goal was to cut off their escape route and drive them back toward Reno's advancing troops. Reno's march had its own challenges. The trail Reno followed was narrower and less obvious than the larger Lodgepole Trail that split off to the right. Once Reno's forces reached a small knoll near the river, they lost sight of Custer's column. It was here that Gerard warned Reno about the Native Americans advancing toward them, but his warnings went unheeded as the command continued forward. Believing this was critical information, Gerard rode back to inform Cook, but by then Custer's fate was already in motion. At the Reno Court of Inquiry, no one could definitively say they had seen Custer. After the split, though, Private Thomas F. O'Neill later claimed in a 1909 interview that Custer had come within a few hundred yards of the river before veering off yet. This assertion conflicts with Trumpeter Martini's testimony, which suggested Custer never went near the river but watered his horses some distance away. The confusion around Custer's exact movements highlights how chaotic the situation had become. Moving rapidly, Custer led his men up higher ground, using the rolling terrain to shield his movements. This route, leading towards Sharpshooter's Ridge, allowed Custer to maintain an elevated vantage point while keeping his command within sight of the valley below. True to his bold and sometimes reckless nature, Custer rode ahead of his men, outpacing them with his well-rested horses. From his elevated position, he could see Reno dismounting to form a skirmish line, and he directed his own troops towards sloping ground that funneled into a coulee, leading them between two prominent landmarks, Sharpshooter's Ridge and the Weir Peaks. The terrain, as much as Custer's tactical mind, dictated the path forward. In a significant interview conducted by Walter Camp on September 18, 1908, Curley, a Crow scout who had accompanied Custer for part of the way, offered a rare glimpse into the path Custer took. According to Curley, Custer moved along a high ridge, crossing over to a bluff about 500 feet north of Reno's position. This ridge provided Custer and his men with a commanding view of the river and the valley beyond, giving them a strategic vantage point. As they galloped along the bluffs, Custer and his entire command had a clear view of Reno's forces for about 3/4 of a mile. before disappearing into Cedar Coulee, which led them toward Medicine Tail Coulee. Curley's account sheds light on some of the key moments during Custer's final push, though much remains speculative. For instance, while Curley described Custer's command as moving through a valley between ridges, there is some ambiguity in his description, leaving room for debate about the exact route Custer took. What is clear, however, is that Custer's decision-making during these final hours, while quick and decisive, was fraught with misjudgment and missed opportunities. Though we may never know exactly what transpired in those final moments, the accounts of those who witnessed portions of the battle offer tantalizing clues. The uncertainty, however, is what makes Custer's last stand such an enduring and controversial chapter in American history. On August 24, 1919, several years after the camp dialogue, General Hugh L. Scott interviewed Curley, White Man Runs Him, and the Minneconjou warrior Feather Earring, who was present during the famous battle. In his notes, Scott recounted the scene. Custer turned around when he reached the top of the ridge, waved his hat, and his men below responded with their own cheers and hat waving. He continued along the ridge, and his men followed closely behind. We pushed our horses to keep up with Custer and his troops. At one point on the ridge, Custer turned to the right and followed a coulee moving in a northerly direction. The term "turn to the right" can be misleading, however. If we imagine Custer at the ridge's high point, which is elevation 3,411, and surveying the Reno fight, a turn to the right would indicate a movement off his right shoulder towards Cedar Coulee. In 1910, Camp conducted another interview, this time with Carlo DiRudio. While DiRudio did not specifically identify a trail, he hinted that Custer's command was moving in a column of fours. However, in certain narrow spots, they shifted to a column of twos. This likely referred to Cedar Coulee, a spot too tight for a larger formation. Lieutenant Win Edgerly of Company D was later quoted in the Leavenworth Times from a statement he made at Fort Yates. In 1881, I led the troop after Captain Thomas Weir, and after covering some distance, I veered off to the right into a small valley, which must have been the same or a parallel one that Custer used. We moved toward the mass of Indians we had previously seen from a high point. As Edgerly's unit moved down the valley, Weir, who was still positioned on the bluff, motioned for them to return. This location is what we now call Weir Peaks. However, in the early 1900s, Camp revisited Edgerly's account, likely via a letter, and recorded a notable detail. When Weir and Edgerly left Reno, did they see Custer's trail? Edgerly could not recall seeing it anywhere. Despite Edgerly's inability to recall the trail, this isn't surprising given the chaotic circumstances. Reno's command was in disarray. Nearby Indians were still aggressively engaging, and confusion reigned. Firing volleys were heard in the distance, and amidst the turmoil, Custer's exact path was not a priority for anyone. At that moment, Reno's position was untenable. Orders were unclear and supplies were far off. Regardless, it was apparent that Custer had headed north, his destination clear to anyone paying attention. Edgerly, with no specific orders, instinctively followed a natural North Cedar Coulee, the same as Custer. At the vantage point of 3,411, Custer had a clear view of the situation. Reno was engaged in the valley, doing exactly what Custer had tasked him to do: keep the warriors occupied. This allowed Custer to determine the next phase of action. His hunch was correct. The Indian forces were attempting to cover the retreat of their families. He needed to move north to intercept them and assess the scale of the retreat. Cedar Coulee appeared to offer a viable path for this, allowing him to pursue the fleeing non-combatants while seeking a suitable river crossing. Modern analysis of Cedar Coulee has led to the debate about whether Custer's men could have traversed its narrow juniper-filled path. But such objections overlook several key factors. First, Custer would have had no way of knowing about the obstacles in the coulee beforehand, and once committed, he likely would not have turned back. Second, it is uncertain whether the juniper bushes were as dense in 1876 as they are today. Third, military formations of the time were highly flexible, and Custer's men were adept at adjusting to terrain. Reno's unit, for instance, switched from a column of fours to a column of twos as they crossed the Little Bighorn River. Similarly, Custer's command could have easily adjusted formation as the coulee narrowed, perhaps by moving in twos or sending some men along the coulee's banks. James Willard, discussing Curley's movements, mentioned how the Crow scout returned to the column from a vantage point in a sagebrush ravine, moving away from the valley. This suggests that Cedar Coulee had at least some vegetation, which could have influenced Custer's maneuvers. The coulee was more challenging than anticipated, with its length of over a mile, making for a 15 to 20-minute journey under ideal conditions. Custer's men were moving faster, but by the time he reached the head of the column, after his scouting from 3,411, the advanced troops were already well into the coulee and had halted, bunching up. To continue with any semblance of order, it is reasonable to assume that Custer adjusted his formation once more, possibly splitting the column into twos or guiding his men along the slopes to avoid thick vegetation. As Custer's column moved, they were not unnoticed. Hostile forces, including at least 20 named Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, were positioned to cross the river. Among them was a Hunkpapa warrior named Iron Cedar, who crossed the river to alert Chief Gall. By the time Gall and Iron Cedar reached the bluffs, they witnessed Custer's men approaching Medicine Tail Coulee. Custer's sudden appearance shocked the native forces, further heightening the tension of the moment. By 2:05 p.m., Custer had reached the front of his column and ordered a message to be sent back to Bentinni. The descent through Cedar Coulee had been arduous, likely necessitating shifts in formation. But by 2:25 p.m., Custer had emerged from the coulee and regrouped his troops without hesitation. He pushed forward, turning left into Medicine Tail Coulee, heading towards the Little Bighorn River. Unbeknownst to Custer, his movements were being closely monitored. Among the watching warriors was Iron Cedar, who, after witnessing Custer's advance, rushed to alert Gall. Within minutes, Gall and Iron Cedar crossed the river, hurrying to warn the village. By 2:39 p.m. the warning had spread, signaling the next phase of the battle. At approximately 2:30 deep within Medicine Tail Coulee and heading toward the river, Custer noticed an easy incline to his right that led to the top of a ridge. Understanding that crossing these hills would allow him to continue northward and gain a clearer view of the valley, he adjusted his command's direction and ascended the ridge. Note how these actions flowed naturally, without any need for major deviations from the original plan. By 2:39 p.m., Custer and his leading forces reached the top of Loose Ridge. The terrain was favorable, allowing the rest of the battalion to follow closely behind. From this vantage point, Custer surveyed the valley below and saw a massive exodus of Native Americans, likely numbering in the thousands, fleeing northward. Moments later, the air was pierced by shouts as a lone rider, galloping at full speed, approached. It was his younger brother Boston, who arrived at 2:40 p.m. and relayed urgent news about Reno's retreat and Bentinni's approach along Reno Creek. Though the news about Reno's retreat was alarming, Boston had only witnessed the initial stages of it, leaving the full extent of the retreat and Reno's chosen path unknown, details that held much greater significance than initially thought. Common reasoning would suggest that Reno would retreat back up the valley, a fact that likely never crossed George Custer's mind. Custer probably didn't anticipate that Reno could have been forced to cross the river earlier than expected, thereby creating a situation where Reno's fragmented forces might end up between Custer and Bentinni. This is not as improbable as it seems, given that Reno's Up Valley retreat was the logical route. Private Daniel Newell explained it clearly. Our first idea when retreating to the river was to go back to the place where we had crossed earlier. But by then the Indians we had passed in the timber were ready for us and they cut off that route. Our only choice was to push through to the river. Even Native American eyewitnesses like Foolish Elk noticed this dynamic. In a 1908 interview he mentioned how the soldiers retreated across the river at the nearest point they could reach. Two hurried to backtrack to the ford, where they entered the valley. Had Custer understood these implications, he might have reconsidered his advance, and the outcome of the battle could have been drastically different. Additionally, his decision to move northward indicates that Reno's struggles were not a priority for him. What's especially intriguing is Custer's cool analysis of the situation. He processed the information about Bentine's arrival and calculated that based on his own march times, Bentini would reach his current position in roughly 1 to 1.25 hours. Around 4 p.m., this meant Custer had to move toward a ford just west of his position, evaluate the situation, and if necessary, continue north, finding a suitable crossing, and placing himself where his forces could regroup and launch the next phase of their assault. We will later see how Custer adhered to this meticulous timing. Boston Custer's role in this whole affair is an often overlooked aspect. He tends to be dismissed as merely a latecomer, catching up with the main column in Cedar or Medicine Tail Coulee, though it's doubtful either is true. What we do know is that Boston initially stayed back with the pack train to secure a fresh horse, and it's unclear exactly where he rejoined the column. Afterward, he spent the rest of the journey trying to catch up with his brothers. Along the way, he exchanged brief words with Bentine's men, who were watering their horses, and had a quick chat with Martini just south of Reno Hill. When George Custer halted his column near the divide, the pack train was still behind. If Boston had gone back for a horse exchange at that point, it's likely he caught up with the main force just before they reached Loose Ridge. Unfortunately, historical records don't offer much more detail. What stands out, however, is that Boston was likely the only one who could inform his older brothers of Reno's situation. A rare mention of Boston's connection to the pack train comes from a 1909 letter by Tom McDougall, in which he recalls talking to Boston, likely after the regiment crossed the divide, and the battalion breakdown occurred. Boston likely switched horses at this point and rejoined the column as it moved out again. Another account from a company trumpeter, William G. Hardy, adds some clarity. Hardy recalled that Boss Custer was with the 5 companies when Reno separated, and that he was going to where the fighting would be. While Hardy didn't specify which separation he was referring to, whether the one at the divide or the one in the flats near the lone teepee, it's plausible he was talking about the divide. Notably, Hardy's mention of Hayden might simply be a mix-up of names, which was common given the many aliases used by the soldiers. Boston's next documented sighting occurred around 1:50 p.m. as Bentine's battalion reached Reno Creek. Lieutenant Edgley recalled seeing Boston galloping toward the general's command, greeting him cheerfully as he rode past, unaware that he was heading to his death. Boston had covered 8 miles from east of the divide, but at a relatively slow pace of 5 to 7 miles per hour. When he realized he wasn't closing the distance to his brothers quickly enough, he sped up to a gallop, pushing hard to reach them before the inevitable battle. Even with George Custer's stops along the way, Boston's pace would have needed to remain consistent if he hoped to catch up before the killing began. By the time Boston met Martini at around 19 p.m., he had increased his pace to around 12 miles per hour. They exchanged information briefly. Martini reportedly mentioned that Bentini was down yonder and that Boston's horse had been shot, and then Boston continued on. He passed over Reno Hill at 2:24 p.m., likely witnessing soldiers retreating from the advancing Native Americans. Navigating Cedar Coulee would have been challenging for a large column of troops, taking them roughly 20 minutes to make their way through. However, Boston, unburdened by military formation constraints, was able to navigate the Coulee quickly, covering the distance in around 8 minutes at a rate of 8 miles per hour. He entered Medicine Tail Coulee at 2:35 p.m., accelerating once more as the terrain opened up, and finally arrived behind his brothers at Loose Ridge at precisely 2:40 p.m. This timeline, based on speed and distance, aligns well with the known facts, making other scenarios less likely and any other timeline almost impossible.